The moment I walked into that family meeting, I could already feel the weight of their judgment before a single word was spoken. My in-laws didn't even try to hide their disappointment anymore. They looked at me like I didn't belong in the room. And within minutes, I was once again the target of everything they thought I had failed to become. "She's a failure," my mother-in-law said loudly, right in front of everyone, as if I wasn't even sitting there. My husband didn't defend me. He just looked away. That silence hurt more than anything they said. If this story resonates with you, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if it truly speaks to your heart. And let me know where you're watching from, your city or country, and what time it is there right now. My name is Jessica Carter. I'm 39 years old, and what happened in that house was the moment my entire family life started to unravel in ways I never expected. That night began like every other so-called family meeting at my in-laws' estate in Virginia, where polished wood floors and expensive furniture always seemed to echo their sense of superiority. I remember sitting at the long dining table, hands folded calmly, while my husband Mark's family took turns listing everything I had supposedly failed to do since marrying into their world. They spoke about my career, my choices, even the way I carried myself, as if every detail of my life was something they had the right to judge. My father-in-law barely looked at me when he spoke, calling me a disappointment to the family name, while my mother-in-law nodded along like she had rehearsed the moment for years. There was no anger in my response, only silence, because I had learned over time that anything I said would only feed their need to diminish me further. But inside, something was shifting. Not anger exactly, but a quiet awareness that they had no idea who I truly was or what I had lived through before ever stepping into their world. Mark sat beside me, tense but quiet, caught between loyalty and fear of his family's approval, and that silence from him created a distance I could feel more sharply than their words. As they continued, I found myself remembering fragments of a life they had never asked about, a life that existed long before I became Mrs. Carter in their eyes, a life built on discipline, structure, and responsibility in ways they could never understand. Still, I didn't interrupt them. I let them speak, let them believe their version of me was the only version that mattered, because something deeper in me was observing rather than reacting. That was when I noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way conversations paused slightly longer between insults, the way even Mark's voice softened when he finally tried to change the subject and failed. The night felt like it was building towards something none of them could see yet, something just outside their understanding. I didn't know it at the time, but this was only the beginning of a much larger moment, one that would bring someone into that room who would change the way every single person there looked at me forever, and everything before that moment was just the silence before the truth began to surface. The more they spoke, the more I could feel the room narrowing around me, as if every word from my in-laws was pressing closer without anyone noticing. My mother-in-law leaned forward again, her voice calm but sharp, reminding everyone at the table that I had never truly belonged in their world, that I had simply been tolerated out of politeness for far too long. My father-in-law followed with a slow nod, adding that success in their family meant reputation, connections, and visible contribution, none of which he believed I had ever provided. I sat there listening without interruption, my hands resting still on my lap, my expression steady in a way that seemed to frustrate them even more than any argument would have. Mark shifted beside me, his jaw tight, but he still did not speak, and that silence from him settled heavily between us like a distance that had been growing for years without either of us fully acknowledging it. One of his relatives even let out a small laugh, as if agreeing with everything being said was the easiest way to keep the atmosphere comfortable, and that sound made the entire moment feel even more isolating. I remember looking down at the table surface, noticing the reflection of the overhead light on the polished wood, and thinking how strange it was that something so calm on the surface could hold so much tension underneath. They continued listing things I should have done differently, choices I should have made, ways I should have behaved, each sentence stacking on top of the last until it felt less like conversation and more like a verdict being delivered. I did not interrupt because something in me had already shifted from reacting to observing, as if I were watching a situation I was no longer emotionally allowed to defend. That was when Mark's sister quietly added that even after years in the family, I still carried myself like an outsider, like someone who never fully accepted their standards, and the way she said it made a few people around the table nod in agreement. I could feel the pressure building in the room, not explosive, but steady and controlled, like a tide slowly rising without warning. Then my mother-in-law said something that made the entire table go slightly still, stating that if I truly understood what it meant to be part of their family, I would have already stepped aside rather than continue to sit there pretending I belonged. For a moment, no one spoke after that, and in that brief silence I became aware of how many eyes were still fixed on me, waiting for a reaction I was not going to give them. Instead, I simply exhaled slowly, as if I had all the time in the world, which seemed to unsettle them even more. Mark finally glanced at me, but whatever he was looking for in my expression, I could tell he did not find it, and that seemed to make him even more uncertain. The atmosphere in the room felt suspended, like something important was approaching but had not yet revealed itself, and in that space between words and judgment, my phone resting near my hand suddenly lit up with a notification from an unknown number. I did not move immediately, but I noticed it, and for some reason the timing felt deliberate, almost like it belonged to the same moment. No one else saw it yet, or if they did not react, because the attention in the room was still fixed on me as if waiting for me to finally break. But I had the sense that whatever was about to happen next was not coming from inside that room, and that the confidence they all shared in that moment was about to be tested in a way none of them were prepared for, because something or someone was already on the way that would completely change the balance of everything being said about me. The notification on my phone stayed lit for a second longer than it should have, and even though I did not open it, I could feel a shift in the air around me, as if something outside that room had already begun moving toward us. My in-laws were still speaking, still confident in every word they used to define me, but I was no longer fully listening in the same way, because part of my attention had already separated from them. Mark noticed me glance down and he frowned slightly, asking quietly if everything was okay, but I simply nodded without explaining, because there was nothing in that moment I could explain in a way he would understand. My mother-in-law continued speaking, this time more firmly, stating that respect in their family had to be earned and that I had done nothing to earn it, and a few people around the table murmured in agreement as if it was a settled truth. I could feel the weight of their expectations pressing into the silence after each sentence, expecting me to respond, to defend myself, or to finally break under the pressure they had built so carefully. Instead, I remained still, watching them more than reacting to them, as if I was seeing the situation from a distance that they could not reach. Then, from outside the house, there was a faint sound of movement, not loud enough for anyone to notice yet, but enough to make me subtly straighten in my seat. Mark's father was the first to glance toward the large front windows, distracted for a moment, then quickly dismissed it as nothing, and continued speaking, but I noticed the hesitation in his expression before he moved on. A few seconds later, the sound of a vehicle stopping outside became clearer, followed by a brief pause that felt intentional rather than random, like someone had arrived exactly when they meant to. Still, no one in the room fully reacted yet, because the conversation inside was still dominating their attention, and they were still too confident in their control of the situation to imagine anything interrupting it. My phone lit up again, this time with a message that simply read that the arrival had been confirmed, and I placed it face down on the table without changing my expression. Mark leaned slightly closer, asking in a lower voice what was going on, but before I could answer, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. The conversation at the table did not stop immediately, but it began to slow as people started noticing the change in atmosphere, the way footsteps approached with purpose rather than hesitation. Then a man in a formal military uniform entered the room, and the entire energy shifted instantly without a single word being spoken. He was not rushed, not uncertain, but controlled in the way only someone used to command presence could be, and every eye in the room slowly turned toward him. Mark's voice faded mid-sentence as he looked up, confused, while my mother-in-law's expression tightened as she tried to understand why someone like that would be standing in their home unannounced. The man scanned the room once, then stopped when his eyes landed on me, and in that exact moment, the silence became absolute. He took one step forward, then another, and everything about the way he moved suggested recognition rather than curiosity, as if he already knew exactly who he had come to see. And just before anyone could speak or question what was happening, he raised his hand in a formal salute toward me, holding it steady, and the entire family froze in place as the meaning of that single gesture began to sink in without a single explanation yet being given. The moment the colonel held his salute, the entire room seemed to forget how to breathe, as if time itself had stopped inside that expensive dining space. No one moved, no one spoke, and the silence stretched longer than anyone was comfortable with, because there was no explanation yet for what they were witnessing. My mother-in-law's face tightened as she looked between me and the man in uniform, trying to force logic into something that did not fit anything she believed about me. Mark slowly stood halfway from his chair, then stopped, his eyes locked on the colonel as if waiting for someone to clarify that this was a mistake. The colonel finally lowered his hand, but his posture remained firm, controlled, and unmistakably authoritative, and when he spoke, his voice carried a calm weight that filled the entire room without effort. He addressed me first, not anyone else, using my surname with a level of respect that immediately changed the temperature in the room again. I did not respond right away, not because I was confused, but because I knew exactly what was happening, and I was measuring how much of it I was ready to reveal in front of them. The colonel took one step closer and glanced briefly around the table, noticing every face frozen in disbelief, then returned his focus to me and asked if I wanted him to proceed. That simple question alone made Mark shift uncomfortably, because it suggested history, context, and authority that none of them had ever been aware of. My father-in-law finally found his voice and asked, with forced calm, what exactly was going on and why a military officer was standing in their home addressing me like that. The colonel did not answer him immediately, instead waiting, as if the correct answer depended on my permission rather than their understanding. That silence created a divide in the room, separating those who were certain of their superiority from the reality they were about to lose control of. I slowly leaned back in my chair, my hands still steady, and for the first time that evening, I looked directly at each person around the table without lowering my gaze. The colonel then spoke again, this time explaining that he had personally served under my command during a classified operational assignment years earlier, and that he had not expected to encounter me here under such circumstances. The words "under my command" did not immediately register for everyone, but when they did, the shift in expression around the table was almost visible all at once, confusion turning into disbelief, and disbelief turning into something much heavier. Mark whispered my name as if trying to anchor it to the person he thought he knew, but there was no certainty in his voice anymore, only uncertainty and shock. My mother-in-law suddenly let out a small, disbelieving laugh, but it died quickly when she realized no one else was reacting the same way. The colonel continued speaking calmly, stating that my service record had been far above what most people in that room would ever be exposed to, and that my presence here was never meant to be public knowledge. That sentence changed everything, because it reframed every insult they had thrown at me earlier as something completely disconnected from reality. I noticed Mark's father gripping the edge of the table slightly tighter, as if the physical object was the only thing keeping him grounded, while the rest of the family sat in stunned silence trying to process information they were not prepared for. The colonel finally turned slightly toward them and added that disrespecting a high-ranking officer, even unknowingly, carried consequences they clearly did not understand, but his tone was not threatening, only factual. And in that moment, I realized the true weight of what was unfolding was not just recognition, but the complete collapse of the version of me they had confidently believed in for years, because nothing in their assumptions about my life could survive what was being revealed right in front of them. The room remained frozen in a state of disbelief, as if every person there had collectively forgotten how to react to what they were hearing and seeing. The colonel's words still lingered in the air, heavy enough to silence even the smallest movement, and I could feel every set of eyes slowly shifting between him and me, searching for something that would make the situation understandable again. My mother-in-law finally broke the silence, her voice unsteady for the first time that evening, asking what kind of military assignment could possibly place me in a position of command over someone like him, as if she was trying to rebuild control over a conversation that had already slipped away from her. The colonel did not answer immediately, instead maintaining his composed stance, but I could see the subtle respect in the way he remained slightly angled toward me rather than the family seated around the table. Mark's expression had completely changed now, no longer frustration or confusion, but something closer to disbelief mixed with a growing realization that everything he thought he understood about me was incomplete. I remained seated, my posture steady, But inside, I could feel the weight of years collapsing into this single moment, where silence was finally speaking louder than anything I had ever said. The colonel finally continued, explaining in measured detail that my role in military logistics had placed me in command of critical operations that supported entire divisions, operations that required absolute trust and authority under pressure. Each sentence added another layer of distance between the version of me they had mocked and the version of me that actually existed beyond their home, beyond their assumptions, and beyond their judgment. I watched as Mark's father slowly loosened his grip on the table, his face no longer showing confidence, but instead a quiet uncertainty, as if recalculating every insult he had delivered earlier in the evening. My mother-in-law attempted to speak again, but her words lost strength halfway through, as if she no longer knew which version of reality she was supposed to defend. The colonel then turned slightly toward the family and stated calmly that, while this was not an official military setting, the presence of a senior officer still carried weight that should never be dismissed or misinterpreted, and that respect was not optional when rank and service history were involved. That statement alone shifted the atmosphere again, not through intimidation, but through undeniable truth that no one at the table could logically challenge. Mark finally stepped fully away from his chair, his voice low as he asked me why I had never told him any of this. And the question carried more than curiosity. It carried the weight of years of assumptions that had now been proven incomplete. I looked at him for a moment, not with anger, but with the calm understanding of someone who had already lived through far more than this conversation could explain in a single sentence. I told him quietly that some parts of my life were never meant to be measured by approval or recognition, and that silence had often been necessary for reasons he had never asked about. The colonel observed this exchange without interruption, then added that my record had always been kept secure for operational reasons, which meant that even close personal relationships would not have had access to that information. That explanation did not comfort anyone at the table, but it clarified why they had never known and why their confidence in judging me had been built on incomplete understanding. I noticed my mother-in-law looking down at the table now, no longer speaking, no longer correcting, no longer trying to control the narrative, while the rest of the family sat in a silence that felt entirely different from the silence earlier that evening. This was no longer the silence of judgment, but the silence of realization, where every assumption they had made about me was slowly collapsing under the weight of facts they could not ignore. And as I sat there watching each of them process what could not be undone, I understood that the meeting had stopped being about their opinions of me a long time ago and had become something none of them were prepared for, a moment where truth had entered the room and refused to leave. In the days after that family meeting, everything in my life felt strangely quieter, as if the noise I had been living under for years had finally been turned off. There were no more sharp comments at the dinner table, no more subtle insults disguised as concern, no more conversations where I had to measure every word just to stay accepted. My relationship with Mark never returned to what it had been before that night, not because of anger, but because truth had a way of changing how people look at each other once it is fully seen. He tried to speak to me several times after everyone left that evening, but most of what needed to be said could not be reduced to quick explanations or apologies. His family, once so confident in their judgments, had become distant, unsure how to interact with someone they had misunderstood so completely. I did not celebrate what happened, and I did not try to punish anyone. Instead, I stepped back. I asked for space, not out of revenge, but because I finally understood something important about myself that I had ignored for a long time. For years, I had allowed my value to be measured in rooms where I never truly belonged, and I had mistaken silence for acceptance when it was actually self-erasure. The colonel reached out once more before leaving, not to intervene, but to confirm that I was safe and that my record remained secure, and I thanked him quietly for his respect rather than his authority. After that, life became simpler in ways I did not expect. I focused again on structure, discipline, and purpose, the same principles that had carried me through my military years, but this time I applied them not to service, but to myself. There was still sadness at times, but that sadness no longer controlled me. It simply passed through, like a reminder rather than a weight. I began to understand that not every relationship is meant to be repaired, and not every voice deserves access to your identity. Some people can only see you through the limits of their own understanding, and that has nothing to do with your worth. If there is anything I learned through all of this, It is that silence is not weakness when it comes from clarity, and distance is not cruelty when it comes from self-respect. You do not have to fight every battle to prove who you are. Sometimes, the truth reveals itself on its own, at the exact moment it is needed. And if you are listening to this right now, feeling overlooked, misunderstood, or dismissed by people who were supposed to care about you, I want you to know something gently and honestly. You are not defined by the voices that fail to see you. You are not limited by the expectations placed on you in moments where your full story was never known. Trust your inner voice when it tells you that something is not right. Trust your path, even when others do not understand it. And if you believe in something greater, whether you call it faith, God, or the universe, trust that as well, because sometimes clarity arrives in ways we do not expect, but exactly when we need it most. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If this story reached something inside you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories like this. It means more than you know to be part of a space where stories like this can be heard and felt. My name is Jessica Carter. I am 39 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this: never let anyone define your worth in a room where your truth has never been fully seen.